To the Moon and Back. NASA's Apollo program. The Apollo program, also known as Project Apollo, was a monumental space exploration initiative carried out by the United States under NASA. It succeeded in its bold objective of landing humans on the Moon, forever altering the course of space exploration and human history. The Apollo program was conceived during President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration in the early 1960s as a follow-up to Project Mercury, the first U.S. human spaceflight initiative. The idea was to develop a larger, more advanced spacecraft capable of carrying 3 astronauts, with potential missions including ferrying crews to a space station, conducting circumlunar flights, and achieving the ultimate goal of landing humans on the Moon. However, it wasn't until the presidency of John F. Kennedy that the mission to land on the Moon became a clear national priority. In May 1961, President Kennedy addressed the U.S. Congress, boldly committing the country to landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to the Earth before the decade was over. This ambitious goal was a direct response to the perceived dominance of the Soviet Union in the space race, especially after the launch of the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. The Apollo program was not only about scientific discovery but also about demonstrating American technological superiority during the Cold War. The Apollo program was deeply rooted in the political dynamics of the Cold War, particularly the space race between the US and the Soviet Union. The US sought to establish its superiority in space exploration and missile technology. As a result, Apollo became not only a technical endeavor but a symbol of national pride and resilience. The US government and NASA dedicated vast resources to achieving Kennedy's goal, with more than 400,000 employees and contractors working on the project at its peak. The Apollo program thus served as a tool for geopolitical influence, showcasing the United States' commitment to scientific progress and its ability to execute complex, high-stakes endeavors under intense international scrutiny. This political significance was particularly evident in the global broadcast of the Apollo 11 moon landing, which was watched by an estimated 1/5 of the world's population. The path to the moon was far from smooth. The program encountered numerous technical, financial, and operational hurdles. One of the most tragic setbacks was the Apollo 1 disaster in 1967, in which astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee perished in a cabin fire during a pre-launch test. This tragedy led to a significant re-evaluation of safety protocols and the redesign of spacecraft components to prevent future accidents. Moreover, the Apollo missions required advancements in many areas of science and technology. This included developing the powerful Saturn V rocket, the Apollo spacecraft, comprising the command and service module and the lunar module, and life support systems like spacesuits. Apollo's technical demands spurred innovations in avionics, telecommunications, and computer technology, some of which have had long-lasting effects beyond the program itself. Despite these difficulties, the Apollo program made several landmark achievements. Apollo 8 became the first crewed spacecraft to orbit the Moon in 1968, while Apollo 11 made history with the first human landing on the lunar surface on July 20, 1969. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin famously spent more than 2 hours exploring the Moon, while Michael Collins remained in lunar orbit in the command module. This success was a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of NASA and the broader scientific community. Apollo's legacy is monumental. The program succeeded in sending 12 astronauts to the Moon between 1969 and 1972, a feat that remains unparalleled in human space exploration. Beyond the surface achievements, Apollo brought back 842 pounds, or 382 kilograms of lunar rock and soil, contributing enormously to the understanding of the Moon's geological history. These samples have provided scientists with critical insights into the formation and composition of Earth's only natural satellite. Apollo's legacy extends well beyond its scientific contributions. It laid the foundation for future space missions, particularly the development of NASA's human spaceflight capabilities. The program funded the construction of key facilities, including the Johnson Space Center and the Kennedy Space Center, both of which remain integral to NASA's operations today. Additionally, the technological advancements made during Apollo have had broad implications, particularly in fields like computer science and telecommunications, where innovations spurred by the program are still in use. Apollo's cultural and environmental impact is also worth noting. The famous blue marble photograph of Earth, taken by the crew of Apollo 17, became a powerful symbol of the environmental movement, reminding humanity of the fragility and interconnectedness of life on Earth. The program's broad reach, from scientific discovery to its influence on environmental activism, showcases its lasting impact on society. While Apollo had a profound and lasting impact, it was not without its challenges, particularly when it came to maintaining public and political support after the initial moon landing. After Apollo 11, interest in lunar exploration began to wane, both in Congress and among the American public. The high cost of each mission, coupled with the political desire to rein in federal spending, particularly under President Richard Nixon, led to the gradual scaling back of the Apollo program. 3 planned lunar missions were cancelled, and the last crewed mission, Apollo 17, took place in December 1972. In the end, Apollo's contributions to human knowledge and technological advancement were immense, but its steep costs and changing political priorities meant that it could not continue indefinitely. The final Apollo mission marked the end of an era of unprecedented human exploration beyond Earth. The Apollo program stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. From its origins in Cold War politics to its profound impact on science, technology, and culture, Apollo transcended its initial goal of landing humans on the moon. It became a symbol of human ingenuity, determination, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. Though it concluded in the early 1970s, Apollo's legacy continues to shape NASA's missions and inspire future generations of explorers. Its lessons and accomplishments remain relevant as humanity once again looks to the moon, and beyond, to chart its future among the stars. Reform, repression, and resistance. The Prague Spring. The Prague Spring of 1968 was a transformative moment in Czechoslovak history, marked by attempts at political liberalization and the ensuing Soviet-led invasion aimed at quashing those reforms. It began with the election of Alexander Dubček as the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in January 1968, and ended abruptly with the Warsaw Pact invasion in August 1968. This short but significant period left a profound legacy, influencing both local and international political developments during the Cold War. The Prague Spring was primarily born out of growing dissatisfaction with the rigid communist regime established in Czechoslovakia after the Second World War. The centralized political system, heavy censorship, and lack of personal freedoms fueled discontent among both intellectuals and ordinary citizens. The election of Alexander Dubček on January 5, 1968, symbolized the growing momentum for change. Dubček sought to reform socialism in the country, promoting a concept of socialism with a human face. He envisioned a system that maintained socialist principles while allowing for greater personal freedoms, political openness, and economic reforms. Dubček's reforms were embodied in the action program he introduced in April 1968. This document called for the decentralization of the economy, increased political pluralism, and greater freedoms of speech and press. The action program also sought to limit the authority of the Communist Party, making it more accountable to the people. These reforms resonated with a population weary of censorship and political repression, and for a brief moment, it seemed that Czechoslovakia could develop a more democratic version of socialism. Dubček's reforms triggered enthusiasm across various segments of Czechoslovak society. Media outlets, no longer restricted by censorship, began openly criticizing the government. Intellectuals, students, and workers seized the opportunity to participate more actively in political discourse, calling for further reforms. The brief period of freedom saw the rise of cultural movements, including music, literature, and film, as expressions of newfound liberties. However, the growing reform movement in Czechoslovakia raised alarms in the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact nations. To the Soviet leadership, Dubček's policies posed a significant threat to the stability of the Eastern Bloc, as they could inspire similar movements in other communist states. Negotiations between Dubček and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev ensued, but they failed to bridge the ideological gap between the two leaders. On the night of August 20 to 21, 1968, Warsaw Pact forces, including troops from the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, invaded Czechoslovakia to put an end to the Prague Spring. The invasion was swift and overwhelming, with over 200,000 troops and 2,000 tanks entering the country. Despite the massive military presence, the Czechoslovak people responded with mostly non-violent resistance, with some isolated instances of armed conflict. Protesters constructed barricades, and students clashed with Soviet troops in the streets of Prague. The response from the international community was generally condemnatory. Western nations, particularly the United States, expressed dismay but did little in terms of direct action, preoccupied as they were with the ongoing Vietnam War. The United Nations held discussions on the invasion, but Soviet veto power in the Security Council effectively stifled any meaningful resolutions. Following the invasion, Dubček remained in power for a short time, but his ability to enact further reforms was severely curtailed. By April 1969, Dubček was replaced by Gustav Husák, a more conservative leader, who aligned himself with Soviet interests. This marked the beginning of a period known as normalization, during which the country returned to the pre-reform status quo. The liberalizing efforts of the Prague Spring were systematically dismantled. Censorship was reinstated, political dissidents were persecuted, and any remaining calls for reform were crushed. Husák's leadership was characterized by a reassertion of hardline communist control. Intellectuals and reformers associated with the Prague Spring were purged from government positions, and many were forced into exile or silenced. Alexander Dubček himself was expelled from the Communist Party, and spent the next 2 decades working as a forestry official. The normalization period lasted until the Velvet Revolution of 1989, which finally brought an end to communist rule in Czechoslovakia. Although the Prague Spring ended in military suppression, its legacy continued to influence political movements within Czechoslovakia and beyond. In the short term, the event caused widespread disillusionment with Soviet-style communism, not just in Czechoslovakia, but also across the Eastern Bloc. Many leftist intellectuals in the West, previously sympathetic to the Soviet Union, became critical of its authoritarianism following the invasion. This led to the development of Eurocommunism in Western Europe, a more independent and democratic form of communism that sought to distance itself from Soviet orthodoxy. The cultural impact of the Prague Spring was also profound. The brief period of liberalization had allowed for a flourishing of artistic and intellectual expression, and many of the works created during this time continued to inspire future generations. Filmmakers, writers, and musicians who had taken advantage of the relaxed censorship rules during the Prague Spring produced works that criticized both the communist regime and the invasion. Although censorship returned after 1968, the cultural shift initiated by the Prague Spring could not be entirely reversed. The memory of the Prague Spring remained contested for years, particularly in the Czech Republic. For many, it symbolized the crushing of hopes for a more humane socialism. Even after the fall of communism in 1989, there were conflicting views on how to remember the event. While some saw it as a heroic attempt at reform, others viewed it as a painful reminder of the Soviet Union's dominance over Czechoslovakia during the Cold War. The Prague Spring was a pivotal moment in Cold War history, symbolizing both the possibilities and the limitations of reform within a communist state. Although its immediate impact was the reassertion of Soviet control over Czechoslovakia, the long-term effects were far-reaching. It deepened disillusionment with Soviet-style communism, contributed to the development of Eurocommunism in the West, and left an indelible mark on Czechoslovak society and culture. While the Prague Spring ultimately failed to achieve its goals of political liberalization, its legacy continues to be felt, both in the Czech Republic and in broader discussions about the nature of socialism and democracy. The 1968 Peruvian coup d'état. A turning point in Peruvian history. The 1968 Peruvian coup d'état marked a significant moment in the nation's political landscape. It was a critical turning point that ended the democratic presidency of Fernando Belaúnde Terry and ushered in a military regime led by General Juan Velasco Alvarado. This event not only reshaped the political structure of Peru but also had far-reaching implications for its economy and society. The coup occurred in a period of heightened political instability and economic turmoil in Peru. The immediate catalyst for the military takeover was the Page 11 scandal, a dispute between the Peruvian government and the International Petroleum Company, IPC, a U.S. firm that had long controlled the La Brea y Pereñas oil fields in northern Peru. A missing page from a contract between the Peruvian government and IPC led to allegations of corruption, with many Peruvians believing that their country was being exploited by foreign corporations. The scandal became a national controversy, and its fallout seriously undermined the administration of President Belaúnde Terry. At the time, the Peruvian armed forces, particularly the army, had grown increasingly disillusioned with the Belaúnde government. They believed that the president had failed to protect Peru's national interests, especially regarding the IPC affair. Furthermore, the military was concerned that Belaúnde's inability to effectively govern could lead to social unrest and a potential uprising by the leftist American Popular Revolutionary Alliance, the APRA, a political party with strong populist leanings. Fearing that Peru was on the brink of collapse, the military decided to intervene. In the early hours of October 3, 1968, a squadron of tanks and armored vehicles, supported by infantry, surrounded the presidential palace in Lima. The operation was meticulously planned to avoid bloodshed, and the military forces quickly overpowered the presidential guards without firing a shot. President Belaúnde was woken up at around 2 a.m. by General Velasco Alvarado, who informed him that he was being deposed. According to some reports, Belaúnde offered no resistance and appeared to have been drugged the night before, possibly by traitors within his own administration. Within hours of the coup, the military had taken control of the entire country. Congress was dissolved, and its members were briefly detained, with many sent into exile. Belaúnde himself was forced onto a military jet and flown to Argentina, where he would spend years in exile. General Velasco, who had been serving as the commander-in-chief of the Peruvian army, quickly assumed the role of president. His regime, which lasted until 1975, became known as the Revolutionary Government of the Armed Forces. Velasco's government promised to implement radical reforms aimed at addressing the deep-rooted social and economic inequalities that had plagued Peru for decades. These reforms included land redistribution, nationalization of key industries, and the establishment of state control over the country's resources. One of the most immediate and significant actions taken by Velasco's government was the nationalization of the IPC's oil fields. Just days after the coup, the Peruvian army took control of the disputed oil fields in the Talara province. This move was widely popular among the Peruvian public, who saw it as a bold step toward reclaiming their country's sovereignty from foreign exploitation. Velasco's government embarked on an ambitious program of social and economic reform, often referred to as the Peruvian Revolution. The most notable of these reforms was the Agrarian Reform Law of 1969, which aimed to redistribute land from wealthy landowners to poor farmers. The government expropriated millions of hectares of land, turning large estates into cooperatives and giving landless peasants ownership of the land they worked. While this policy was intended to reduce rural poverty and improve agricultural productivity, its implementation was often chaotic, and the results were mixed. In some cases, the cooperatives were poorly managed, leading to decreased agricultural output and further economic difficulties. In addition to land reform, Velasco's government pursued a policy of nationalizing key industries, including mining, telecommunications, and banking. The government sought to reduce Peru's dependence on foreign capital, and ensure that the country's natural resources were used for the benefit of its people. However, these nationalization efforts often led to conflicts with foreign governments and corporations, particularly the United States, which saw its business interests in Peru threatened by Velasco's policies. The Velasco regime also implemented a series of social reforms aimed at improving the lives of Peru's marginalized populations. These reforms included efforts to expand access to education, healthcare, and housing. The government invested heavily in infrastructure projects, particularly in rural areas, in an attempt to modernize the country and reduce regional inequalities. Despite these efforts, however, the economic challenges facing Peru continued to mount, and by the early 1970s, the country was facing a severe financial crisis. By the mid-1970s, Velasco's revolutionary government was facing increasing opposition from both the left and the right. The economic situation had deteriorated significantly, with inflation skyrocketing, and the country struggling to repay its foreign debts. Many of the government's ambitious reforms had failed to deliver the promised results, leading to growing disillusionment among the population. In addition to economic difficulties, Velasco's health began to decline. In 1975, he was diagnosed with a serious illness, and underwent surgery to have his leg amputated. His weakened condition led to a loss of support within the military, and in August 1975, he was ousted in a bloodless coup led by General Francisco Morales Bermudez. Morales Bermudez promised to continue Velasco's reforms but soon moved to roll back many of the more radical policies, shifting the country back toward a more market-oriented economy. The 1968 coup and the subsequent Velasco regime had a profound and lasting impact on Peru. Velasco's government, despite its shortcomings, succeeded in shifting the political discourse in the country. It challenged the dominance of the traditional elite and brought issues of social justice and economic inequality to the forefront of national politics. While many of Velasco's reforms were undone in the years following his ouster, some of the changes he initiated, particularly in the areas of land reform and nationalization, had long-term effects on Peru's economic structure. Moreover, Velasco's emphasis on national sovereignty and the defense of Peru's natural resources resonated with future generations of political leaders and activists. In conclusion, the 1968 Peruvian coup d'état was a pivotal event in the nation's history, bringing an end to a period of democratic rule and ushering in a decade of military-led governance. General Juan Velasco Alvarado's government, while controversial and ultimately unsuccessful in achieving many of its goals, left a lasting legacy that continues to shape Peruvian politics and society to this day. Sailing over the Moon. NASA's Apollo 8. The Apollo 8 mission, a pivotal event in space exploration, was the first crewed mission to orbit the Moon. Launched on December 21, 1968, it became a defining moment not only for NASA's Apollo program but also for human spaceflight, marking significant achievements in the race to the Moon between the United States and the Soviet Union. Originally planned as a mission to test the Apollo lunar module and command module in medium Earth orbit, it was later repurposed into a lunar orbital mission after delays with the lunar module. Apollo 8 was the second crewed mission in NASA's Apollo space program, following Apollo 7, which tested the spacecraft in Earth's orbit. The initial plan for Apollo 8 was to conduct a crewed mission that included both the lunar module and command service module in a medium Earth orbit. However, due to technical delays with the lunar module, NASA made a bold decision to change the mission profile. The new goal was to send a crew to orbit the Moon, a far more ambitious endeavor than the original plan. In August 1968, NASA decided to proceed with a lunar orbital mission even though the lunar module was not yet ready. This change required reassigning the astronaut crew from Jim McDivitt's team, originally scheduled for this mission, to the Apollo 9 mission, which would focus on the lunar module. Instead, Frank Borman's crew, which included James Lovell and William Anders, was assigned to Apollo 8. The Apollo 8 crew was composed of 3 highly experienced astronauts: Commander Frank Borman, Command Module Pilot James Lovell, and Lunar Module Pilot William Anders. Each member brought a unique set of skills and experiences that contributed to the mission's success. Borman, a former Air Force pilot, had previously commanded Gemini 7, a long-duration mission. Lovell, who flew with Borman on Gemini 7, had also participated in the Gemini 12 mission, gaining extensive spaceflight experience. Anders, the least experienced astronaut on the team, had served as a backup astronaut for Gemini 11. NASA's rigorous training regimen was an essential component of the mission's success. Borman's crew had only 2 to 3 months to prepare for Apollo 8, significantly less time than planned. Additionally, they had to forego lunar module training and instead focus entirely on translunar navigation and command module operations. Apollo 8 was launched from Kennedy Space Center on December 21, 1968, using the Saturn V rocket. It was the first crewed launch of the powerful Saturn V, marking another milestone in space exploration. The 3-stage rocket worked flawlessly, placing the spacecraft into Earth orbit before initiating a translunar injection, which sent Apollo 8 on a trajectory towards the Moon. The journey to the Moon took 68 hours, during which time the crew conducted various experiments and made navigational adjustments. As they approached lunar orbit, the mission entered its most critical phase. The spacecraft was placed into an elliptical lunar orbit, allowing the astronauts to circle the Moon 10 times over the course of 20 hours. This part of the mission provided the first human view of the far side of the Moon, a previously unseen region. One of the most memorable moments of the Apollo 8 mission was the Christmas Eve broadcast, during which the astronauts read from the Book of Genesis. The live broadcast was seen by millions of people around the world and became one of the most watched television programs in history. The reading, coupled with the imagery of Earth rising above the lunar horizon, created an emotional connection between the mission and the global audience. During the mission, the crew also captured the iconic Earthrise photograph, a breathtaking image of Earth rising above the Moon's surface. This photo became one of the most famous images of the 20th century and played a significant role in sparking environmental awareness on Earth, contributing to the early momentum of the environmental movement, and the first Earth Day in 1970. Although the mission was a resounding success, it was not without its challenges. The Saturn V rocket, while reliable, had faced technical issues during its development, including problems with pogo oscillations, which could cause dangerous vibrations during flight. Engineers worked tirelessly to address these concerns, retrofitting the Saturn V with solutions that allowed for a safe and smooth launch. The crew, also, had its concerns about the mission's safety. Borman later revealed that they had estimated only a 50% chance of success, highlighting the risks they faced. Apollo 8's successful lunar orbits marked a series of firsts in human spaceflight. It was the first time humans had left Earth's gravitational influence and orbited another celestial body. The crew's successful completion of the mission paved the way for the future lunar landings, particularly the Apollo 11 mission in 1969, which achieved President John F. Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the Moon before the end of the decade. After completing 10 orbits of the Moon, Apollo 8 fired its engine to initiate the trans-Earth injection, which sent the spacecraft on its return trajectory to Earth. The crew splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean on December 27, 1968, where they were recovered by the USS Yorktown. Upon their return, the astronauts were hailed as heroes, and Time magazine named them the Men of the Year for 1968. The mission had far-reaching effects beyond its technical achievements. It demonstrated that a crewed mission to the Moon was not only possible but also achievable within the timeframe set by President Kennedy. Apollo 8 boosted the morale of the American public during a turbulent year marked by political assassinations and social unrest, symbolizing hope and the promise of human potential. Apollo 8 is remembered as one of NASA's most significant achievements. It represented a turning point in the space race, proving that the United States had the capability to reach the Moon and return safely. The mission's success provided the confidence and experience needed for the subsequent Apollo missions, particularly Apollo 11, which would ultimately fulfill Kennedy's dream of a moon landing. Moreover, Apollo 8's cultural and environmental legacy continues to resonate today. The Earthrise photo, in particular, has been credited with inspiring a greater awareness of the fragility of Earth and the need to preserve the planet's environment. This image, taken from a vantage point no human had ever experienced before, shifted perspectives and helped to foster the growing environmental movement. In conclusion, Apollo 8 was a groundbreaking mission that demonstrated the power of human ingenuity, perseverance, and teamwork. Its successful orbit of the Moon set the stage for future lunar landings and remains a symbol of what can be achieved when humanity reaches for the stars. The Troubles. A protracted conflict in Northern Ireland. The Troubles, a violent conflict in Northern Ireland, spanned from the late 1960s until the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. This conflict primarily involved disputes over the status of Northern Ireland, whether it should remain part of the United Kingdom or unite with the Republic of Ireland. The Troubles were marked by deep-rooted tensions between two key groups: Unionists, who were mostly Protestant and favoured remaining in the UK, and Nationalists, predominantly Catholic, who aspired to join a united Ireland. Despite its nationalistic undertones, the Troubles had significant ethnic and sectarian dimensions, contributing to its complexity and longevity. Northern Ireland was established as part of the United Kingdom in 1921, following the partition of Ireland. This political division sowed the seeds for future strife. The Catholic minority in Northern Ireland faced widespread discrimination in employment, housing, and political representation at the hands of the Protestant-dominated government. Over time, civil rights movements emerged in the late 1960s, seeking to address these systemic inequalities. However, their peaceful protests were often met with violent suppression by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, and Protestant loyalist groups. This repression only exacerbated tensions, leading to widespread civil unrest. One of the key early moments of the conflict was the August 1969 riots, which erupted in response to civil rights marches and the violent reactions of loyalists and police forces. The British government deployed troops to restore order in Northern Ireland, marking the beginning of a military presence that would last for decades. Although Catholics initially welcomed the British Army as a neutral force, this perception shifted dramatically following the events of Bloody Sunday in 1972, when British soldiers shot 26 unarmed protesters, killing 14. Bloody Sunday became a rallying point for Irish nationalists and significantly increased support for paramilitary groups like the Provisional Irish Republican Army, the IRA. The Troubles saw the emergence of several paramilitary groups on both sides of the conflict. On the nationalist side, the Provisional IRA was the most prominent, engaging in guerrilla warfare against British forces, as well as conducting bombings against infrastructural, commercial, and political targets. Other Republican groups included the Irish National Liberation Army, INLA, and various factions of the IRA, such as the Official IRA and later splinter groups like the Real IRA and the Continuity IRA. On the Unionist side, the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, and the Ulster Defence Association, the UDA, were the main loyalist paramilitary organisations. These groups primarily targeted Catholics in retaliation for IRA attacks, contributing to the spiralling violence. Many loyalist paramilitary attacks were brutal and aimed at terrorising the Catholic community as a whole. For instance, the UVF and UDA carried out tit-for-tat killings in response to IRA bombings, further deepening the cycle of violence. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, various efforts were made to negotiate a peace settlement, but these were repeatedly hampered by the deeply entrenched positions of both sides. Nationalists sought the reunification of Ireland, while Unionists were determined to remain within the UK. In 1972, the British government suspended the Northern Ireland Parliament and introduced direct rule from London, an attempt to restore order. This measure was intended as a temporary solution, but it ended up lasting for over 2 decades. During this period, several ceasefires were attempted, but they often collapsed amid continuing violence. Notable among these was the 1975 IRA ceasefire, which ultimately failed as both sides remained deeply suspicious of each other's motives. The UK government's strategy shifted between military action and political engagement, but neither approach seemed to yield a lasting solution. The Troubles had a devastating impact on Northern Ireland's civilian population. More than 3,500 people were killed over the course of the conflict, with civilians making up a significant portion of the casualties. Approximately 52% of those killed were civilians, while 32% were members of the British security forces, and 16% were members of paramilitary groups. The violence also led to the widespread segregation of communities along religious lines. Catholic and Protestant neighbourhoods became fortified enclaves, separated by peace walls intended to keep the two sides apart. These physical barriers reinforced the deep divisions within Northern Irish society, and made reconciliation even more difficult. Additionally, Northern Ireland witnessed mass protests, civil disobedience, and riots throughout the 1970s and 1980s, contributing to the overall instability. The 1990s saw a renewed push for peace, culminating in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. This landmark accord was the result of years of negotiation between the British and Irish governments, as well as representatives from Northern Ireland's main political parties, including Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA. The agreement established a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland, designed to ensure that both Unionists and Nationalists had a role in governance. One of the key provisions of the Good Friday Agreement was the decommissioning of paramilitary weapons and the demilitarization of Northern Ireland. It also addressed issues of human rights, policing, and justice, all of which had been flashpoints during the conflict. The agreement was overwhelmingly endorsed in a referendum held in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, marking a turning point in the conflict. While the Good Friday Agreement did not bring an immediate end to all violence, sporadic attacks continued for several years. It laid the groundwork for a lasting peace. The IRA officially announced an end to its armed campaign in 2005, and loyalist paramilitary groups also declared ceasefires. Since then, Northern Ireland has gradually moved towards normalcy, although sectarian tensions remain. The legacy of the Troubles continues to shape Northern Ireland today. While the violence has largely subsided, the deep political, social, and cultural divisions that fueled the conflict persist. Sectarianism remains an issue, with schools, neighborhoods, and even sports teams often divided along Catholic-Protestant lines. The peace walls, erected during the height of the conflict, still stand in many areas, symbolizing the ongoing need for reconciliation. Moreover, issues related to justice and accountability for the events of the Troubles continue to be a source of contention. Many victims and their families seek justice for atrocities committed during the conflict, while others advocate for moving forward without reopening old wounds. The Troubles were a complex and multifaceted conflict that left an indelible mark on Northern Ireland. Spanning over 3 decades, the conflict involved not only political and nationalistic disputes but also deep ethnic and sectarian divisions. The violence claimed thousands of lives and traumatized generations, while also entrenching divisions within society. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 represented a significant step toward peace, but the process of healing and reconciliation is ongoing. Northern Ireland today stands as a testament to both the enduring scars of conflict and the possibility of peace after prolonged strife. Operation Menu. The covert U.S. bombing of Cambodia. Operation Menu was a covert bombing campaign launched by the United States in Cambodia between March 18, 1969, and May 26, 1970. The campaign, which primarily targeted the People's Army of Vietnam, the PAVN, and the Viet Cong, VC, sanctuaries in Cambodia, was a controversial and significant component of the broader Vietnam War. Despite its secretive nature, Operation Menu had a profound impact on both the Vietnam War and the Cambodian Civil War, sparking debates about its legality, effectiveness, and humanitarian consequences. To understand the origins of Operation Menu, it is essential to examine the political and military landscape of Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. By the late 1960s, U.S. forces were deeply entrenched in Vietnam, fighting against the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, and its southern ally, the Viet Cong. The conflict had spilled over into neighboring countries, including Cambodia, which became a key operational base for the NVA and VC. Cambodia's geographical location, bordering South Vietnam, made it a critical area for NVA and VC operations. The sanctuaries established in eastern Cambodia allowed these forces to train, resupply, and launch cross-border attacks on US and South Vietnamese troops. However, the presence of NVA and VC forces in Cambodia created a diplomatic and military dilemma for the US, as Cambodia, under the leadership of Prince Norodom Sihanouk, maintained a neutral stance in the Vietnam War. The US government, under President Richard Nixon, sought a solution to disrupt the NVA and VC sanctuaries in Cambodia without provoking an international outcry or compromising Cambodia's neutrality. Operation Menu, named after different meals such as breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack, was conceived as a covert bombing campaign aimed at weakening the NVA and VC's operational capabilities while keeping Cambodia's involvement in the war under wraps. The primary objectives of Operation Menu were to degrade the NVA and VC's supply lines, destroy their bases, and force them to retreat deeper into Cambodian territory. By doing so, the US hoped to limit the NVA and VC's ability to launch offensives against South Vietnam, thereby providing a strategic advantage for US forces and allowing for a more gradual withdrawal of American troops from the conflict. The decision to launch Operation Menu was made by President Nixon in early 1969, shortly after he assumed office. Frustrated by the slow progress of peace negotiations in Paris and the persistent attacks by the NVA and VC, Nixon turned to his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, for advice on how to intensify the pressure on North Vietnam. Together, they devised a plan to conduct covert airstrikes in Cambodia without seeking approval from Congress or informing the American public. The bombing began on March 18, 1969, with Operation Breakfast, which involved the use of B-52 Stratofortress bombers to carpet bomb the NVA and VC's sanctuaries in the Cambodian region known as the Fishhook. Over the next 14 months, US bombers conducted a series of raids under the codename Menu, targeting 6 areas along Cambodia's eastern border: breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, supper, and dessert. These operations were carried out with extreme secrecy, with only a handful of top military and government officials aware of the campaign. Nixon and Kissinger went to great lengths to ensure that Operation Menu remained classified. To avoid detection, the bombing missions were recorded as attacks on South Vietnam, and aircrews were briefed to believe that their targets were within South Vietnamese territory. Additionally, a dual reporting system was established to separate the covert bombing missions from regular US air operations in Vietnam. The humanitarian consequences of Operation Menu remain a subject of intense debate. The bombing campaign targeted areas in Cambodia with both military and civilian populations, leading to significant casualties among Cambodian civilians. According to US Department of Defense estimates, the 6 areas bombed during Operation Menu had a non-combatant population of approximately 4,247. However, other sources suggest that the actual number of civilian casualties could be much higher, with some estimates placing the death toll in the tens of thousands. The widespread destruction of Cambodian villages and infrastructure exacerbated the suffering of civilians and contributed to the destabilization of the Cambodian government. Militarily, the effectiveness of Operation Menu is also a matter of contention. While the bombing campaign inflicted heavy losses on the NVA and VC, it ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The NVA and VC were able to adapt to the bombing by dispersing and camouflaging their forces, limiting the effectiveness of the airstrikes. Furthermore, the US failed to eliminate the Central Office for South Vietnam, COSVN, the NVA's headquarters in Cambodia, which had been one of the primary targets of the campaign. Despite these setbacks, Nixon and Kissinger declared Operation Menu a success, arguing that it had bought time for the implementation of Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of military responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces. However, the bombing campaign did not prevent the NVA and VC from launching further offensives, and by 1970, North Vietnamese forces were still operating in Cambodia with relative impunity. As the secrecy surrounding Operation Menu began to unravel, the campaign became a major political controversy in the United States. In December 1972, the existence of the bombing was revealed when Major Hal Knight, a former U.S. Air Force officer, sent a letter to Senator William Proxmire questioning the legality of the U.S. airstrikes in Cambodia. This disclosure led to congressional hearings and intensified scrutiny of the Nixon administration's conduct during the Vietnam War. The revelations about Operation Menu had significant legal and constitutional implications. Under the U.S. Constitution, the power to declare war rests with Congress, yet Nixon had authorized the bombing of Cambodia without congressional approval. Several constitutional experts testified before Congress that Nixon's actions were illegal, further fueling the growing opposition to his administration's handling of the war. The political fallout from Operation Menu, combined with mounting opposition to the Vietnam War, contributed to the broader disillusionment with the Nixon administration. The secrecy and deception surrounding the campaign were seen as part of a pattern of abuses of power that ultimately culminated in the Watergate scandal, which led to Nixon's resignation in 1974. Operation Menu officially ended on May 26, 1970, but the U.S. bombing of Cambodia continued under a new operation called Freedom Deal. The legacy of Operation Menu remains contentious, with some historians arguing that it was a necessary measure to weaken the NVA and VC, while others contend that it exacerbated the suffering of the Cambodian people and contributed to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, which eventually seized control of Cambodia in 1975. Operation Menu was a pivotal yet controversial chapter in the history of the Vietnam War. As a covert bombing campaign, it reflected the Nixon administration's willingness to escalate the war in Southeast Asia while circumventing both Congress and the American public. While the campaign may have temporarily disrupted the NVA and VC's operations in Cambodia, it ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives and left a legacy of destruction and political controversy that resonates to this day. The humanitarian toll of the bombing and the legal and ethical questions it raised serve as reminders of the complexities and consequences of covert military operations in times of war. In the next chapter, we will examine NASA's historic moon landing, as well as the Palestinian insurgency in South Lebanon, the 1969 Libyan Revolution, and the near disaster of Apollo 13. Please like and subscribe. Please.